I was going to follow up with a little bit of background that I think I forgot to do for Tuesday's class that would be helpful. Um, so some of you may have had this, some of you may have not have had this, but this is how people or economists, resource economists, maybe others as well, I don't know, think about goods. That they are can be excludable or non-excludable. It can be rivalrous or non-rivalrous, and Chris referred to this idea that there are things that fit into each of these categories. So let's start down in the lower right for club goods. So club goods are non-rivalrous. In other words, your use of them doesn't necessarily deprive somebody else's use of them, but they are excludable. And so these are things like cinemas or private parks or cable TV, and that you pay, or it's therefore um, easy to put these within economic systems and have payers support the production of these goods or these maintenance of these goods or the sustainability of these goods because they can be excluded. And as a consequence, even though you don't run out of uh, website access when somebody else is accessing a website, people can provide the websites because there's a mechanism for them to be compensated for that. Moving up to the upper right, private goods are just what they sound like. They're rivalrous and also excludable. A car. I can drive the car, and if I'm driving the car, you can't be driving the car. And vice versa. Burning gasoline or not burning gasoline. Food, clothing, newspapers, these are all things that are private goods and that they work well within economic markets, that a market can set a value for cars and gasolines and newspapers depending on the cost of supplying those goods and demand for them. In the upper left are these non-excludable resources that are rivalrous. And so in other words, one person's use of them doesn't affect the outcome of it's rivalrous, so they can be depleted. Fish, game, forest, timber, etc. can all be depleted, but it's difficult and sometimes impossible to exclude other people from using it, so they're non-excludable. And this is where we have these things called common pool or common property resources, and we think of water irrigation systems, fishing grounds, fish stocks, etc., as these kinds of resources. And then there are public goods, and these public goods are things that are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So things like lighthouse or air is a good example. I think that was the one Chris used, is that our use of the air doesn't deplete anybody else's, and there's not really a good way to deplete someone's use of air. But things like a lighthouse or streetlights are also similarly situated, such that your use of a streetlight doesn't preclude somebody else's use of the streetlight, and it also doesn't. It's also, you can't charge someone for the use of lights that are provided on the street. But these public goods are called public goods because they're the sort of things that no one would invest in and do unless it was by virtue of a government, that it's a government public good. And so private individuals don't build lighthouses because there's no way to charge the people who take the services off of the lighthouse. And there's no way to exclude someone from using the attribute of lighthouses that make them useful. And so these are the kinds of things that become then public goods. Now, economists look at supply and demand curves, and that they look like these sorts of things, and that if you have some quantity and price, as the quantity as the price goes up, then the supply should go up in some kind of supply curve. As the price goes down, then demand goes up on some kind of demand curve, as in the upper left here. And where the supply and demand curves meet is this law of supply and demand, where you have some theoretical optimum amount of quantity of a good that would be produced by a market, and a theoretical price that that market would support. The two graphs in the lower section are both, well, they're both similar. They're kind of the same graph. But in this case, we're imagining a demand curve. And again, it doesn't matter really whether it's a straight line or a curved line, but it's a demand curve. And the idea is that for natural resources, where people who are exploiting the natural resources aren't paying the cost of production, then you basically have acquired it at a reduced cost. So the price per unit is lower, as in one of the marginal private costs, or the private cost in the blue line. So as a timber harvester, you have a cost associated with cutting down the tree and processing the wood, but not necessarily of growing the wood if the wood is on a public land. And so what happens then is that because the private cost is low, that there can be a social cost. Somebody is paying the price of making sure that the land's not erodible, et cetera, and that there's then a social cost. And what that means is that the true cost of providing a good may be the upper red line, and such that there's an equilibrium supply and demand, an optimal price, and a amount of quantity that would be produced, but that what ends up happening is an excess is produced and sold at a market price that's below this optimal price. And so economists point to this and say this is why taxing things like taxing goods, making people pay to harvest timber, or to pay to fish, or pay to hunt, or pay to do the other things, can readjust for that marginal social cost of production of that good, and bring us back to the optimal price of a particular good. And so this is where you get sort of these approaches that says that when you have open access common property, things like trees and forests and fish at sea, that approaches to fixing these things are the government can apply a tax or fee for use to force people to internalize the externality. That upper line, that difference between the upper social cost and the private cost, is called an externality in economics terms. And that the government can restrict access to the common resource, and so you can still give the people access at and only incur the private cost of production, but then you have to do something else that brings the quantity produced down, and that would be restricting access. Or the government can assign private property rights and basically make them excludable resources. Now note in this one, again, there isn't that a recommendation that comes out of all of Eleanor Ostrom's work, which is basically that there are these common pools, and that local common governance can resolve the problem. Now perhaps that's implied because there's no scale associated with this government word here. It could be a federal government using a top-down approach, or a governance of the community, I guess. But that's the way economists think about this problem. And so if you look again at this list of rivalrous and non-rivalrous goods, and excludable and non-excludable issues, there's this tension that there are things that often could fall in different boxes. There are things like wild game, timber, fish, that can be treated as common pool resources. They can be privatized into private goods with tradable quotas, fishing grounds, timber sales, hunting licenses, and that's one way in which the environment's managed. They can be turned into club goods by making them excludable, but when they're used, particularly this works when they're used in non-extractive cases, so that the wild game, forest, timber, water, etc. are in parks down there. But they can also be treated as if they're public goods, and then this becomes the real problem. And so there are many, many classic cases where we've treated a resource that could be a common pool resource as a public good, a non-excludable and non-rivalrous good. So timber in the southern, northern, and western states in the early 20th century were all treated as if they weren't going to be depleted through cutting down those timbers. In fact, you think of it as a renewable resource that you cut down a tree, trees regrow. That if you're doing that at a low enough rate, it really is non-rivalrous. And so There's some reason to think that that could work. But open range land in the western United States was a classic example where we terribly overgrazed a lot of lands in the western U.S. because we thought of them as non-depletable and non-rivalrous and non-excludable, and so we had that open, the cowboy on the open range issue. But other things like whales in the open ocean are very non-excludable, and there was a time when people thought of them as non-rivalrous. Now, of course, we don't. Same thing with open ocean fisheries. So these things lack. So lacking excludability or clear boundaries of ostrom then led to the overproduction and collapse of these kinds of resources. And so Ostrom's work, as Chris pointed out, moved towards this idea of thinking beyond privatization and government intervention and thinking about community governance, so governance at a local scale. And that all three of these things are used for resource management in different places. So there are fisheries, for example, where privatization has worked very well and taken us away from these god-awful fishing derbies that last 48 hours and are pretty dangerous to people who are engaged in it. But there's a fairness issue in that what you're really doing is giving away some kind of natural resource, a public thing, to private people, and it's like water rights. I mean, why should somebody have water rights and somebody else not, just because of historical precedents? But then there's also this idea of government intervention. And of course, around the world, there's all sorts of places where government intervention is ineffective because there's ineffective governance. But even in a country like the United States, where we feel we have confidence in our government to a point that we still get things like people taking over a wildlife refuge in eastern Oregon because they feel that the government intervention is unfair and curtails individual freedom and restricts cultural and historical historical access. And that's a relatively minor example of that. That there's many others where there's real significant cultural displacement, like almost everywhere in European settlers on top of indigenous peoples. And so this third one, community governments, is viewed as a very favorable one. It avoids the green grabbing, neo-colonial kinds of arguments and allows the world of conservation to move beyond fences and fines. It's considerably less socially repugnant, but often the challenge is that it lacks the supporting structures that are required to succeed. Also, I'll point out that there is no guarantee that local people actually should choose conservation as a strategic outcome. So if you think back to Chris's example of failure in Peru, that an economist would look at that and say, well, what's the discount value of the resource? And that what might be the rate of economic return? So, for example, if you were to try and extract a resource and get a small amount of income out of it over a long period of time, financially, you might flat out be better as a rational actor to completely extract the resource down to zero, put the money in the bank, and then do nothing for the next n number of years and just live off of the interest, depending on what that discount rate is. And so there are cases where an economist would say these kinds of community governance structures are more likely to fail than others because of discounting and just the sheer economic benefit of doing something else. Now, of course, that's a very simplistic view of it, and that cultures are never that simplistic, and so it's hard to know whether how often economics would rule the day on those sorts of things. But anyway, that's, gosh, a whole another 15 minutes. Sorry to take so long, but a little bit more background on the various kinds of goods that we were talking about yesterday in class, and a different frame, the sort of the economist frame of why these public resources are overexploited and what to do about it, as a contrast to the tragedy of commons approach to it. Okay, thanks.